upset like this because you don't understand. No, you don't understand. Okay, let me tell you something. I'm adopted, and I was introduced to a new family to be a better person.
In 2023, the Monroe County Sheriff's Office in Florida received a call about a vehicle that had been driving on the wrong side of the road for roughly 5 miles. Upon encountering the reported vehicle, a Cadillac CXT, the authorities were engaged in a high-speed pursuit. After the Cadillac was eventually stopped, the driver, who was only identified as Heather, emerged and was stumbling, leading the deputies to suspect she was under the influence. The woman initially denied being drunk and said that she was distressed following an argument with her mother, but then admitted she'd had 3 drinks throughout the day. She agreed to a field sobriety test, which she failed dramatically. At one point, a deputy asked Heather to touch the tip of his finger, but she instead gave it a military salute. She was also unsteady on her feet and adopted a ballerina stance during the walk and turn test. The woman even tried to seduce the officer giving her the test and told him, "Anything you want me to do, I'll do for you." Heather was taken into custody and charged with DUI. While she was being processed at the station, the woman cried profusely and slurred her words. She agreed to provide a breath sample, but then attempted to trick the machine by not blowing into it properly. When the breathalyzer eventually registered her blood alcohol level, it was proven to be roughly double the drink-drive limit. Heather was ultimately convicted of DUI and sentenced to 12 months of probation and 60 hours of community service. Number 8. Lydia Elizabeth Badio. In April of 2023, the Texas Department of Public Safety shared a body cam clip to its Twitter of a woman who was caught people smuggling and who tried to flirt her way out of the situation. 38-year-old Lydia Elizabeth Badio from Edinburgh was stopped while carrying 2 female passengers in her car. They were named Carmen and Joanna Perez on their Texas driving licenses, which subsequently proved to be fake. As the trooper asked if the documents were legitimate and ran them through the verification system, Badio attempted to seduce and distract him. She was recorded on the officer's body cam telling him, "I'm looking at your eyes, sir," adding, "I'm looking at your eyes because you're pretty handsome." The trooper was briefly caught off guard by the remark but quickly resumed his duties. Badio initially claimed the duo were friends whom she'd met at a club. However, when their documents didn't check out and her plan unraveled, Badio admitted that she'd picked them up from a stash house in Mission, where supplies and weapons were reportedly hidden. She was in the process of taking them to Corpus Christi. According to the DPS, the method of illegally transporting women across the state was common, with many of them later becoming trapped in debt bondage and being forced to become escorts. The 2 women found with Badio were illegal immigrants from El Salvador, and they were referred to the U.S. Border Patrol, while Badio herself was arrested and faced 2 charges of people smuggling. Number 7. Janice St James. In 2005, California woman Paula Bonhomme met Jesse Jubilee James, a rancher from Colorado, on a chat room for the Deadwood TV show. A romance blossomed, and in the months that followed, the couple talked on the phone daily. Jesse presented himself as a llama rancher and a firefighter with a love of knitting, and who also suffered from bipolar disorder. Bonhomme spent roughly $10,000 to lavish her boyfriend with gifts that included a dog for his 6-year-old son. Jesse in turn sent her a carving knife and a piece of wood with his initials on it, which he claimed to have salvaged from a fire he'd extinguished. Through her boyfriend, Bonhomme was introduced to over a dozen of the people in his life that included Krista, Jesse's jealous ex-wife, Pablo Quitao, a companion of his from Argentina, and Kake, a rancher friend. They, much like Jesse himself, weren't real. The web of characters and accompanying stories presented to Bonhomme were the elaborate concoction of Janice St James, a woman in her mid-50s from suburban Illinois. She pretended to be Jesse and seduced Bonhomme, reportedly using a voice-altering device when talking to her on the phone. St. James sometimes assumed the identities of people who actually existed via blogs and emails. While speaking to Bonhomme, all of the interactions were carried out towards the end goal of convincing her she'd found her soulmate. The romance hoax reached its climax when Bonhomme terminated her marriage and was prepared to move to Colorado to be with her online lover. Then in 2006, Bonhomme learned that Jesse had succumbed to liver cancer. He left behind a note claiming he'd chosen to die in secrecy. St. James sent Bonhomme an email while pretending to be Reese, Jesse's son, which said, "My daddy really died. I still cry every day." St. James had also been in contact with Bonhomme as herself, pretending to be a friend of Jesse's, and they grew closer after the man's fictitious passing. Bonhomme was heartbroken, and to honor her late lover's memory, she took a trip to the Southwest to visit some of his favorite places, accompanied by St. James. The latter came clean a few months later, much to Bonhomme's shock and subsequent outrage. She sued St. James in 2008 for fraudulently representing herself. The outcome of the suit remained unclear, as it was twice dismissed by courts in Illinois before an appeals court reinstated it in 2012, with the decision being upheld by the Supreme Court. Number 6. Colin Stag. On July the 15th of 1992, Rachel Nickel was walking with her dog and her son on Wimbledon Common in southwest London. While she was passing through a secluded area, 23-year-old Nickel was attacked by a man who stabbed and slashed her with a knife dozens of times before abusing her. Nickel's son was found by a passerby unharmed next to her lifeless, blood-soaked body. He was reportedly repeating the words, "Wake up, mummy." Press coverage and public outrage over the murder's gruesome circumstances placed pressure on law enforcement to bring swift resolution to the case. More than 30 potential suspects were interviewed, with the investigation eventually becoming focused on a man by the name of Colin Stag, who was known to walk his dog on the common. There was no forensic evidence linking the killer to the scene, and criminal psychologist Paul Britton aided the police in putting together an offender profile. The authorities then launched a covert operation codenamed Operation Edsel, which would be in hindsight described as a honey trap. Over the course of 5 months, an undercover policewoman from the Metropolitan Police Special Operations Group seduced Stag to see whether he would eliminate or implicate himself. After winning Stag's confidence, the cop drew out fantasies from him which, upon review, Britain would classify as violent. During one taped conversation, the undercover cop claimed that she enjoyed hurting people, but Stag didn't reciprocate and claimed that he lived a quiet life. The woman went on to say, "If only you had done the Wimbledon Common murder, if only you had killed her, it would be all right." Stag, however, replied, "I'm terribly sorry, but I haven't," even though he'd never admitted to any wrongdoing. The man was arrested, with the police claiming that he described aspects of the murder scene which would have only been known by the killer. The case reached the Old Bailey in September of 1994, where a judge deemed that the police's efforts to incriminate Stag had been marked by deceptive conduct of the grossest kind, while his supposed intimate knowledge of the case had been greatly exaggerated. Stag was acquitted after having already spent about 14 months in custody. The authorities launched a comprehensive review of the Nickel murder case in 2002, using DNA techniques which had only recently been made available. In 2003, after months of testing the victim's clothes, the forensic team obtained a DNA match that was insufficient to confirm an identity, but enough to rule out suspects. In 2006, the police interviewed convicted killer Robert Napper at Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security facility for the criminally insane. Napper, a paranoid schizophrenic and Asperger's syndrome sufferer, had been detained at the institution for over a decade. He'd been convicted of killing Samantha Bissett and her daughter in November of 1993, roughly 16 months after the Nickel incident. Napper was charged with Nickel's murder and ultimately admitted manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility in December of 2008. A judge labeled him a very dangerous man, and he was ordered to be detained at Broadmoor indefinitely. Stag received a public apology from the Metropolitan Police in the aftermath. By then, he'd already sued the force and was granted a compensation of £706,000. The policewoman who'd seduced him retired in 1998 and also sued the Metropolitan Police for damages stemming from the undercover operation. The case was settled out of court and she was given £125,000, with her lawyer describing the police's willingness to award the settlement as their recognition that she sustained serious psychiatric injury. Number 5. Derek Aldred. In 2019, Oxygen Media released the documentary Seduced by Evil, based on the criminal activity of con artist Derek Aldred, who'd swindled his lovers out of a combined $2 million. 9 of his victims spoke out in the documentary, revealing how he'd brought them to the brink of emotional and financial ruin. Aldred assumed numerous identities and backstories, typically pretending he had an impressive career as a US Navy pilot, professor, defense analyst, attorney, doctor, or firefighter. He usually targeted successful and vulnerable women seeking a long-term partner. Aldred seduced them and gained access to their finances. He victimized at least 25 women in California, Hawaii, Minnesota, Texas, and Nevada. He met Cindy Pardini, the woman who would ultimately rally together all of his victims in 2012 through mutual friends. The conversation remained online until 2013, when Aldred asked to stay in Pardini's home while pretending to be an investment banker looking to relocate from Hawaii to San Francisco. Aldred was eventually able to hack into Pardini's finances and stole $250,000. As Derek R. Allard, the con man met Minnesota schoolteacher Joanne Van Huysen on Match.com in 2014. She sensed there was something wrong when Aldred took her to Hawaii to meet his daughter, who never showed up. By the time that Van Huysen learned there was a warrant out for the man's arrest, he'd already robbed her of $24,000. Several more victims followed, and Aldred would sometimes use the money he'd swindled out of one of his victims on gifts to lavish the next woman he conned. He managed to evade arrest, but his operation began unraveling after he met former flight attendant Missy Brandt in 2016 on the dating website OurTime.com. Aldred presented himself as Richie Peterson, a military man who'd completed 8 tours in Afghanistan and even wore a uniform when he spent time with a woman and her daughters. At the time, Aldred was simultaneously dating 2 other Minnesota women, Kimberly Nelson and Linda Dias. They and Brandt all lived within 15 minutes of each other. One day, while Aldred was in the shower, Brandt looked through his wallet and found a Minnesota state ID with his real name and credit cards belonging to Dias. Brandt contacted the woman with whom Aldred was living at the time. They pieced together his web of lies and also found out about Nelson after a care package addressed to Richard Peterson had arrived at Dias's house. Nelson knew Aldred as a man who volunteered at a local homeless shelter, unaware that he'd actually been living at the shelter before moving in with Dias. Aldred's lies eventually caught up with him. He was arrested and faced his punishment in Texas. On December the 21st of 2017, he pleaded guilty to mail fraud and 2 counts of aggravated identity fraud, for which he was sentenced to 24 years in federal prison. 9 of his victims, who'd been tracked down and contacted by Pardini, spoke at the man's sentencing. During his first jailhouse interview in 2020, Aldred seemingly tried to downplay the devastating impact he'd had on his victims by saying, "I'm not trying to justify my behavior. I was a horrible boyfriend, absolutely horrible. Destroying someone's life, I think, is a bit exaggerated." Number 4. Stephen Port. On November the 25th of 2016, British serial killer Stephen Port was sentenced to life in prison with a whole life order after he was found guilty of 4 murders and several assaults. Port typically targeted men on internet dating sites and apps including Grindr, Badio, FitLads, Hornet, and Manhunt. Port, a bald man, reportedly donned a blonde toupee to increase his confidence when interacting with his dates in person. He then took them to his apartment, where he drugged and abused them while they were unconscious. His first fatal victim was 23-year-old Anthony Walgate, a fashion student, whom Port abused and drugged with a lethal dose of GHB. A few days after the murder, on June the 18th of 2014, Port dragged Walgate to the pavement outside his home. He then called for an ambulance and told the operator he'd seen the victim while driving around and that he collapsed or had a seizure or was drunk. The police missed critical details linking Port to the man's death, even after he'd admitted they'd been intimate. he was only convicted of perverting the course of justice because he'd changed his story several times. Port thus went on to murder 3 more men in similar fashion between August of 2014 and September of 2015. The victims were named Gabriel Kovari, Daniel Whitworth and Jack Taylor, all of whom were in their 20s. Kovari and Whitworth were killed within weeks of each other and dumped at St Margaret's Churchyard in Abbey Green, which was close to Port's 1-bedroom apartment in Barking, East London. Port left a fake note next to Whitworth's body which stated that he'd been responsible for Kovari's death and was then consumed by guilt over the murder. After killing Taylor, Port dumped his body in a park adjacent to the churchyard. The original inquest into the deaths returned open verdicts, but once again the police had botched the investigation by failing to forensically test the bed sheet in which Whitworth had been found wrapped. Additionally, they failed to test the GBL bottle found next to his body for DNA or fingerprints. After Taylor's death, CCTV in Barking train station showed him meeting a tall, blonde man who was ultimately identified as Port. He was arrested on October the 15th of 2015. He was found guilty of the 4 murders and 4 assaults, as well as several other charges in connection to him drugging men and abusing them. Number 3. Jill Kelly. Englishman Sam Whitinslow from Hyde had known Jill Kelly since he was a child before he approached her on Facebook in 2017. At the time, he was in his mid-20s and an assistant at Manchester stockbrokers Pilling & Co., while Kelly was a successful businesswoman in her 50s. The young man seduced Kelly and they became involved in an intimate relationship. Whitinslow then presented her with some investment opportunities and introduced her to his associates, Karen Wilson and David Brad. She began talking to them online and they promised to double her money returns. Wilson and Brad were actually aliases set up by Whitinslow. Kelly agreed to invest in the latter's fake schemes, initially opting for 5 bonds before she was persuaded into investing in further bonds for her grandchildren. She would end up losing more than £550,000 in the scam. Businessman Nigel Williams and his wife met Kelly during a holiday to India in 2018, and she recommended they invest with Whitinslow. Williams would end up losing £60,000. Kelly also vouched for her lover while advising Anthony Orrell and his daughter Grace, who were scammed by the con man out of nearly £30,000. The police was alerted after it emerged that Whitinslow had been given a total of £775,600, of which less than £97,000 was repaid under the guise of a return on investment. Whitinslow spent his victims' monies on holidays abroad and online gambling. The man ultimately admitted 5 charges of fraud by representation and was jailed for 3 years. In one of her statements to the authorities, Kelly was quoted as saying, "I feel like I have been groomed, betrayed, and taken advantage of. He seems to take pleasure out of manipulating people." Today's topic was requested by Romella Carme. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Beth Haning. Former probation officer Beth Haning of Redditch in Worcestershire, England, started talking with Rodney Kajo from Ghana in December of 2014. In spite of an age gap of more than 30 years, a romance eventually blossomed. Prior to meeting her musician boyfriend in person, Haning lent him money on 2 occasions, once £200 and again £2,000, which he claimed he needed for studio equipment and to put on some shows. The man reportedly promised to share the profits. Then in August of 2015, Haning flew out to Ghana to meet her online boyfriend in person. They hit it off, and the day before Haning was due to return to the UK in the fall of 2015, Kajo arranged for a surprise wedding. The couple got married and Haning subsequently paid thousands of pounds arranging Kajo's visa. He arrived in the UK in February of 2017 and moved in with Haning at her 3-bedroom house. The relationship, however, soured almost immediately after Kajo had arrived in the UK. Haning told the Daily Mail that he wanted children and that she, a woman in her mid-60s, couldn't have them. Her husband thus grew cold and distant, spending the nights mostly on the couch rather than in their marital bed. Additionally, he complained about Haning's cooking and that he was treated like a slave whenever she asked that he do chores around the house. The woman recalled telling him that's just being a husband. Her family and friends didn't like Kajot, as they recognized he was only after the woman's money. The couple argued constantly, and Haning paid for everything, as her husband sent all the money he made by working in a packing factory back home to Ghana, where he was reportedly building a recording studio. Haning ended up spending £18,000 of her savings on Kajot and his various business ventures, which never panned out. The relationship broke down, with Haning and her husband agreeing that his visa wouldn't be renewed and that he would return to Africa. Haning gave him money for a plane ticket and the taxi ride to the airport. She was then visited by local police and interviewed, a process during which she discovered that Kajot had chosen to remain in Britain and had accused her of domestic violence. The man claimed that the small-framed woman had punched him in the face, splitting his lip open, which Haning vehemently denied. Determined to move on with her life, the woman filed for divorce. Updates from the fall of 2020 indicated that Kajot was living in Birmingham and had asked for asylum. After number 1, we will tune up our previous episodes about when flirting goes wrong for those of you who are longing for more. Stay put if you'd like to. Number 1. Alicia DeBolt. Just before midnight on August the 21st of 2010, teenager Alicia DeBolt left her home in Great Bend, Kansas, to go to a party. When the teen, a cheerleader at her school, didn't return home, a search was launched. It ended when DeBolt's body was found at the Venture Corporation asphalt plant outside Great Bend. Her remains were so badly burnt that the teen's identity was confirmed by her dental records. Traces of duct tape were reportedly found on her mouth and ankles. An analysis of her phone communication revealed that at the time of her death, DeBolt had been seeing 36-year-old Adam Longoria. He'd reportedly begun pursuing the teen after having met her at a party in July. Messages between them confirmed that Longoria had picked DeBolt up on the night that she'd disappeared. He borrowed his girlfriend's car, which reportedly reeked of gasoline when he brought it back. Multiple witnesses testified that Longoria had asked them to lie about his whereabouts on the night. Moreover, his bodily fluids were subsequently found mixed in with DeBolt's DNA in the vehicle. After investigators had identified him as a suspect and law enforcement raided his house, Longoria fled Great Bend in an SUV he'd stolen from his workplace, but he was ultimately tracked down and arrested. It took a jury less than 4 hours of deliberation to find Longoria guilty of capital murder. In the spring of 2012, he was consequently sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Number 8. Belinda Hernandez. A veteran of the Houston police force was jailed after he allegedly murdered his wife of 30 years for flirting with another man. The victim, identified as school librarian Belinda Hernandez, aged 52, was found dead in her kitchen on March the 23rd of 2019 by her adult daughter. Hernandez had reportedly succumbed to multiple gunshot wounds inflicted by her husband, Hilario, who'd been a Houston police sergeant for roughly 3 decades at the time of the incident. After taking his wife's life, Hilario fled south, but he was ultimately apprehended at a motel near the Texas-Mexico border that was located roughly 250 miles from his home in Pearland. Maddened by jealousy, he resorted to murdering his own wife, with whom he shared 2 children, because he thought she was flirting with another man during a gathering with friends. The Houston Police Department relieved Hilario of his duties, and he was ultimately sentenced to 40 years in prison after pleading guilty to first-degree murder. Number 7. Dwight Braithwaite. On December the 6th of 2013, a 21-year-old Brooklyn resident fatally stabbed a man following an argument inside of a fried chicken restaurant. The dispute was reportedly initiated by Dwight Wilkinson, who'd taken issue with what he perceived to be flirtatious interactions between his girlfriend and a stranger at the Flatbush restaurant, who was identified as Dwight Braithwaite, aged 26. After Wilkinson confronted Braithwaite over the alleged flirting, the conflict turned into a physical altercation and spilled onto the sidewalk outside of the establishment. As was captured by video surveillance and subsequently used as evidence against him in court, Wilkinson ran to his nearby apartment building, where he grabbed a knife from his home. He then returned to the street and plunged the blade into Braithwaite's back, inflicting lethal injuries. Wilkinson's girlfriend testified against him during the case's legal proceedings, recounting to the jury how he'd admitted to her that he'd stabbed the victim in a jealous rage. Wilkinson was convicted of first-degree manslaughter and faced a maximum sentence of 25 years in prison. In December of 2020, a man from the Mughal province of Turkey fatally stabbed his own wife after exchanging flirtatious messages with her while posing as a potential love interest online. The suspect was identified as Tanju Achar, aged 32, who'd reportedly carried out the murder after his 25-year-old wife, Selvan Achar, demanded a divorce due to the man's abusive behavior towards her. While concocting a plan to eliminate his partner, Tanju reportedly learned of a local law which stipulated that infidelity could serve as a mitigating circumstance for murder. This aspect of Turkish legislation meant it was possible that Tanju might receive a reduced sentence for killing his wife if he could prove that she'd been unfaithful to him. He subsequently set out to deceive Selvan into thinking she was being courted by various suitors on the internet. Tanju and his friends created fake online profiles and began sending flirtatious messages to Selvan to conjure the illusion that she was cheating on him. The husband's devious plot culminated on December the 8th of 2020 when he stabbed Selvan in the back with a knife. The authorities reported that the blade pierced the woman's heart and she passed away instantly. Although Tanju had sought to lessen the severity of his punishment by using Selvan's purported infidelity as an excuse for his actions, the Fethiye Public Prosecutor's Office demanded the man receive an aggravated life sentence for deliberate murder of a spouse. Under Turkish law, prisoners serving such sentences are only eligible for parole after spending at least 36 years behind bars. Number 4. Isaiah Roberts. On May the 25th of 2012, a jealous man fatally shot a teenage immigrant whom he felt had flirted with his wife on a New York City public transport bus. After the suspected flirtation had already taken place, Lawrence Jones of Brooklyn lured 18-year-old Isaiah Roberts to a remote location near Howard Avenue in Bed-Stuy. It was there that Jones confronted the teen over his alleged inappropriate interactions with his wife. A heated argument erupted between Jones and Roberts, during the course of which the former pulled out a handgun. As the teenager attempted to flee, Jones fired a total of 5 rounds in his direction, with one bullet striking him in the back. Roberts was found by the police lying face down in the street, and he was ultimately pronounced dead after being transported to Kings County Hospital. Jones was taken into custody and charged with the young man's murder, for which he was eventually sentenced to 20 years to life behind bars. The victim, a native of Trinidad, reportedly held aspirations of one day becoming a professional architect. Number 3. Sakira L. A 22-year-old woman was left to bleed out in the middle of a North London street after being stabbed by a jealous acquaintance on September the 8th of 2019. Sakira L. had been targeted by Siobhan Collins Grant, aged 26. The pair had reportedly been friends for a time, but they were said to have experienced a falling out in August of 2019 after Collins Grant accused L. of flirting with her girlfriend, Savannah Simpson, while the women were spending a night out at a club. After engaging in a physical altercation, the two women were thrown out by the nightclub's bouncers. Tensions between Leseke and Collins Grant subsequently died down until the two crossed paths again a few weeks later. On the day of the deadly incident, Collins Grant was standing with 4 other females outside of a friend's residence in Chalk Farm, where she had previously been residing. She'd been kicked out the day before and was there to pick up her clothes. Whilst the group was standing in the street, Leseke and 2 of her friends arrived at the scene. According to court records, Collins Grant charged the victim without warning, delivered a blow to her head, and stabbed her through the breast with a kitchen knife. She then ran to Camden and tossed the murder weapon into Regent's Canal. Emergency medical services were called to tend to Leseke's critical stab wounds. A doctor attempted to perform open-heart surgery on the woman as she lay in the middle of the street, but she was pronounced dead just before midnight. Collins Grant pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Number 2. Fatima Muhammad. A Chicago man carried out the murder of his girlfriend's teenage cousin in West Fargo, North Dakota on June the 6th of 2016. The fatal incident was precipitated by a dispute between 26-year-old David White Jr. and Fatima Muhammad, aged 19. The two were being driven home by Muhammad's cousin, who was in a romantic relationship with White at the time. During the course of the ride, Muhammad allegedly told her cousin that White had been flirting with her. The man was enraged by the accusation, to which he reacted by brandishing a gun and firing a fatal round into Muhammad's head. White threatened to shoot his girlfriend as well if she attempted to run away. He forced her to drive more than 600 miles east to his sister's house in Chicago. After pulling into the garage, White retrieved plastic bags, a laundry bag, and a pair of gloves from inside the residence. He placed the plastic bag over Muhammad's head and put the rest of her body in the laundry bag. The man then set down plastic bags on the floor of one of his sister's closets and situated the dead body on top of them. A few days later, White and his girlfriend dumped the body behind a vacant house near 60th Street and Aberdeen Avenue. White's girlfriend managed to escape his control and flee to her sister's home in Duluth, Minnesota. She went to local authorities to report her cousin's murder, and a short time later, Chicago police were notified of the situation. Muhammad's body was recovered and White was sentenced to 20 years in prison after pleading guilty to attempted murder in North Dakota. He was later extradited to Chicago to face a murder charge. Number 1. Joseph Trevizo. In May of 2018, an individual with mental disabilities was murdered by his own caretaker, who suspected the man of flirting with his girlfriend. Joseph Trevizo, aged 34, was being looked after by 42-year-old Jesse Dackins and his romantic partner, Tiffany Warren. The three reportedly lived together in an apartment in Mesa, Arizona. Court records indicate that the dispute between Trevizo and Dackins had arisen after the former was accused of flirting with Warren. Dackins grew jealous of Trevizo and allegedly attacked him with a knife, fatally stabbing him a total of 27 times in the living room of their home. He subsequently wrapped the victim in a butterfly print shower curtain and placed his body in Warren's car. The couple cleaned up Trevizo's blood and other traces of the attack from the scene of the crime before setting out for Star Valley, where they ultimately disposed of the dead body in the woods. The two then planned to flee to Wisconsin. During the drive there, however, Warren's vehicle broke down and the couple stole a van that belonged to Dackins' former employer. They were arrested by Winslow police on their way out of state on suspicion of vehicle theft. While in police custody, Dackins confessed to carrying out Trevizo's murder and subsequently led officers to the location of the body. Dackins and Warren were charged with first-degree murder, abuse of a child or vulnerable adult, theft of means of transportation, and tampering with evidence. Number 9. Bradley Robert Dawson. In July of 2022, a few months after they'd gotten married, Bradley Robert Dawson and Christy Chen went on their honeymoon to Fiji. The Tennessee-based couple, both in their late 30s, were staying at the secluded $3,500 a night Turtle Island resort on Nanua Levu Island. On the evening of July the 8th, the couple attended a party on the beach, along with island staff and other guests, during which they were both reported to have been drinking heavily. At around midnight, they headed to their private bungalow, where an argument erupted, reportedly centered on Dawson having flirtatiously danced with another partygoer. Guests in the bungalow next door reported hearing loud, banging sounds coming from the room, followed by a scream and then complete silence. On July the 10th, Dawson kayaked a little over a mile to a secluded beach on Matakawa Levu Island, where he eventually encountered local man Manoa Ratulele at around 3 p.m. Dawson, who was visibly agitated while also bearing cuts on his palms and feet, told Ratulele to call the police. By then, however, local authorities had already begun searching for him in connection to the killing of his wife. On the morning after the beach party, the couple's personal butler had found Chen's bloodied body on the bungalow's bathroom floor, squashed between the toilet and the wall. She had suffered multiple traumatic injuries to her body, lacerations to her face and major blunt force trauma to the head. Chen had reportedly been beaten so badly that she was unable to be embalmed, as the fluid would have leaked out of the deep wounds around her eyes. The woman was cremated locally and her ashes were sent to her family in the US. Prior to kayaking to the neighboring island, Dawson had left his cell phone and smartwatch in the bungalow, but had taken his wallet and passport with him. It was interpreted as his intention to flee the country undetected. Dawson was reported to have initially confessed to killing Chen, but after hiring a lawyer, changed his story and maintained that her death had been accidental. He remained in Fiji as of the latest reports, and the court date was set for September the 1st of 2022. Number 8. Ashley MacArthur. In September of 2017, a private investigator and former police officer from Florida was reported missing by her living girlfriend. The latter, named as Cassandra, told the authorities that she hadn't heard back from her partner, 33-year-old Taylor Wright, since September the 8th. Within a few days, her body was discovered at the edge of a remote farm in North Pensacola, owned by the family of her friend, crime scene technician Ashley MacArthur. Wright had been shot in the back of the head before being buried in concrete and potting soil. The police considered both Cassandra and Wright's ex-husband, Jeff, as suspects, but ultimately ruled them out. It was then revealed that the victim had taken out $100,000 from an account she shared with Jeff, whom she was divorcing at the time of her killing. She had given roughly a third of the money to MacArthur for safeguarding. Upon being initially interviewed by the authorities, the latter displayed what was described as a playful and flirty attitude towards the detectives. She admitted to have seen Wright on September the 8th and that they'd gone to ride horses at her family's farm. MacArthur declined having any knowledge about what happened to her after they'd separated. Law enforcement then obtained the woman's bank and phone records indicating she'd lied about her whereabouts and revealing further incriminating information. MacArthur's original flirtatious behavior notably changed during a follow-up interview, which investigators attributed to her knowing she'd been caught. It was revealed that she deposited Wright's money into her own account and then spent the brunt of it, roughly $32,000, to buy a boat for a man with whom she was having an affair. Wright had met her on September the 8th to get the money back, at which point MacArthur executed her. The latter had openly expressed an intention to kill Wright beforehand, claiming she'd do it by tainting her drink. She was ultimately found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder and sentenced to life in prison. Number 7. Jack Elliott. In October of 2019, teenager Jack Elliott died after falling from a boat into Lake Travis in Austin, Texas. After 19-year-old Elliott had gone overboard and was fatally struck by the boat's propeller, other teens that had been partying with him ditched their alcohol and called 911. The group initially offered varied versions of events for how Elliott had ended up in the water that involved him doing a backflip or falling while he was vomiting. The teen's family felt that there were inconsistencies to the story and launched a wrongful death lawsuit the following year, forcing the group to testify under penalty of perjury. L. Weber, who'd been driving the boat, changed her story in a sworn statement and admitted to have seen Elliott getting pushed in the water. He'd reportedly been flirting at the front of the boat with a girl named Delaney Brennan, a fellow student at Texas Christian University. The latter then gave him what Weber described as a playful shove, causing Elliott to lose his balance and fall to his death. Another unnamed teen confirmed the report, claiming he'd heard Brennan reportedly state, "He fell. I didn't mean to push him." In the aftermath, Brennan, who'd initially lied to investigators, subsequently got a tattoo of the victim's initials on her wrist, claiming she wanted to always have something to remember him by. The wrongful death suit was settled privately, but 6 members of the boat group faced criminal charges in connection to the cover-up. Weber, the only eyewitness to Elliott's death, was indicted for giving false information to a police officer, and Brennan for tampering with evidence as she'd allegedly participated in the deletion of an incriminating cell phone video. Their pre-trial dates were scheduled for mid-August of 2022. Number 6. Chris Graham. In April of 2020, British man Chris Graham was jailed for 32 months at Newcastle Crown Court for brutally attacking his ex-girlfriend Melanie Concilio in Washington Tyne Wear. As 46-year-old Concilio later told the authorities, Graham had often accused her of seeing other men throughout their 5-month-long relationship. Concilio had begun feeling uneasy, but as a last resort in saving the relationship, she asked 38-year-old Graham to move in with her. While he was at a friend's house, the woman was unpacking his belongings and stumbled upon a scrap of paper. It was a bizarre to-do list created by Graham, at the top of which he'd written, "Flirt with my ex, The next item was go to the STD clinic and get checked over. Infuriated, Concilio sent the casual window cleaner a breakup text and kicked him out before he'd even moved in. Graham arrived at the address to find his personal property in a corner for him to pick up. He initially seemed to accept the breakup, but a few days later sent Concilio an apologetic text and asked to meet up. The woman reluctantly agreed and they shared a bottle of wine at her home. As Concilio later reported, over the course of their conversation, a switch went off in her ex's head and he started accusing her of seeing other men. Graham threw the mother of 5 on a couch and put his hands around her throat, repeatedly demanding that she admit her supposed wrongdoing. The woman started drifting in and out of consciousness before Graham threatened her that she'd bleed to death. He then repeatedly stabbed her in the knee with a pen, causing her to bleed profusely. Concilio estimated that the man attacked her on and off for roughly 7 hours. Once Graham was gone, she texted her adult daughter for help. Concilio recovered but was scarred for life while Graham was arrested. In addition to the jail sentence, he was given a lifelong restraining order to keep him away from Concilio. A life-threatening flirting incident involving late-night TV king Johnny Carson occurred in 1970 and was subsequently featured in Henry Bushkin's biographical book, Johnny Carson. For years, Bushkin was a personal legal advisor, confidant, and close friend of the late-night host. He revealed that Carson, then arguably the most familiar face on TV, approached a woman at Jilly's Saloon in Manhattan and tried to convince her to go home with him. What Carson didn't know was that the woman's boyfriend was a major figure in New York City's criminal underworld. Bushkin wrote that the boyfriend and a few accomplices roughed Carson up and even threw him down a flight of stairs before bar owner Jilly Rizzo intervened and prevented further violence. In his memoir, P.I. Diaries, Joseph Mullen, who worked as a private investigator for Carson, reported that the attackers then waited for him outside with baseball bats. Mullen wrote that he'd managed to secure a police escort for Carson that eventually took him home. Both Bushkin and Mullen noted in their books that the Mafia put out a contract for Carson's life and that for 3 days he was holed up in his hotel. The matter was resolved after the TV host's agent cut a deal with influential crime boss Joseph Colombo. He'd recently founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League, which aimed to convince the public that people of Italian descent were unfairly stereotyped as mafioso. The league was planning a big rally but had trouble finding TV networks willing to report on it. Colombo lifted the contract on Carson after the man's employers, NBC, agreed to cover the event. A year later, Colombo was gunned down at the second and last Italian Unity rally, suffering near total paralysis. Number 3. Barry Weston. British delivery driver Barry Weston knocked on the door of an unnamed single mother on February the 22nd of 2016 in Staffordshire, England. He asked that she receive a package on behalf of her neighbor. 26-year-old Weston then stepped over the woman's threshold, uninvited, and wrapped his arms around her. He requested to be kissed several times, but the victim was able to push him away. Weston then asked for the woman's phone number, which she reportedly agreed to give out in order to get rid of him. Weston immediately sent her 2 flirty texts. The victim blocked his number and alerted the police, who took the delivery man into custody. He pleaded not guilty to assault but was ultimately found guilty of it. Several months later, Weston was sentenced to a 3-year community order which included 100 hours of unpaid work and a 35-day rehabilitation activity requirement. He was also ordered to register as an offender for 5 years. Number 2. Viacheslav. The body of Russian beauty queen Olga Shlyamina was found in a snow-covered forest of Novodvinsk in the country's northwest, 5 days after she'd been reported missing by her family in March of 2021. The woman had been decapitated and her remains were otherwise mutilated. Local police traced the killing back to her 40-year-old boyfriend, only identified as Viacheslav, whom she'd met after her 2 previous failed marriages. The relationship had been off to a promising start, according to those familiar with their situation, but Viacheslav soon became jealous and violent towards the mother of 2. Then, after 33-year-old Shlyamina had won a local beauty pageant, her boyfriend got paranoid that she'd use her title to flirt with other men. He accused her of having done so with a work colleague and Shlyamina was reportedly looking to end their turbulent relationship. Viacheslav then took the woman for a walk in the forest, where he attacked and beheaded her before hiding her corpse in the snow. Given Viacheslav's documented abusive behavior, he was arrested as the prime suspect and partially admitted his guilt during an initial interview. He claimed to have struck Shlyamina and that the blow may have killed her. Number 1. Edward Shoemaker. In January of 2022, Maryland man David Bennett, who suffered from a terminal heart disease, became the first person in the world to receive a heart transplant from a genetically modified pig. While some lauded the revolutionary procedure, the family of Edward Shoemaker argued that 57-year-old Bennett was undeserving of it. Their ire stemmed from an incident that had occurred at a Maryland bar in April of 1988. Bennett, aged 22 at the time, had been playing pool before he caught his then-wife Norma Jean sitting in Shoemaker's lap and flirting with him. It triggered an altercation which culminated with Bennett stabbing the other man in the back, chest, and abdomen. Bennett was convicted of battery and carrying a concealed weapon, for which he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but ultimately served only half of his sentence. Shoemaker's sister reported that her brother had won a $3.4 million lawsuit against Bennett, but noted that the latter had put everything in his wife's name and ultimately didn't pay him anything. Because of the injuries suffered in the attack, Shoemaker remained paralyzed for nearly 2 decades before he passed away on May the 6th of 2007 at the age of 40. The man's family argued against Bennett's second chance because he'd lived a good life, while they and Shoemaker had had to deal with trauma and hardship left in the wake of the 1988 stabbing. Their indignation would, however, be short-lived. While the pig heart transplant had initially appeared promising, Bennett's health began to deteriorate within a few weeks, a development that reportedly left his doctors devastated. He eventually died in March of 2022. Thanks for watching. Would you rather date your celebrity crush for a month or drive your dream car for a year? Let us know in the comments section below.